First story. Greenbrier. There was a young woman named Elva Zona Shu who lived in Greenbrier County in West Virginia. She was married to a man named Edward who worked as a blacksmith. They seemed very happy together, but Zona's mother never liked Edward Shu and warned her daughter not to trust him. One day, after they had been married only 3 months, Edward sent a young African-American boy named Andy Jones to his house on an errand. He was supposed to ask Zona if there was anything she needed from the store. The boy found Zona's body lying on the floor at the bottom of the stairs. Her eyes were wide open and staring right at him. She was dead. The boy ran home to tell his mother and she raised the alarm. Edward went home, carried his wife's body up to the bedroom and dressed her in her Sunday best. When the coroner arrived an hour later, he found the dead woman wearing a stiff-collared dress that covered her neck and she had a veil over her face. Edward was cradling his wife's head and sobbing hysterically. When the coroner tried to take a closer look, Edward reacted so violently that the coroner gave up and left. He listed her cause of death as being due to childbirth. The strangest thing about it was that Zona had not even been pregnant. When Zona's mother found out her daughter was dead, she shouted, "The devil has killed her." During the funeral, Zona's mother took a sheet from inside the coffin and brought it home. When she washed it in a basin, the water turned as red as blood. The old woman believed this was a sign that Zona had been murdered. Every night for the next 4 weeks, Zona's mother prayed that the truth about her daughter's death would be revealed. She didn't have long to wait. One night, the ghost of Zona appeared to her mother and told her exactly how she had died. She said Edward was cruel and abusive to her. One day, he went too far. She told him she had no meat for his dinner and Edward flew into a rage. He attacked his wife and broke her neck. When she said this, the ghost slowly turned her head completely around at the neck. The next morning, Zona's mother went to the police and told them what she had seen. Although they were skeptical, they dug up Zona's body again and performed a proper autopsy. When he heard the news, Edward began to get nervous and stressed out. He wandered around the town saying, "They will not be able to prove I did it." The autopsy revealed that Zona's neck had been broken and she had been strangled to death. On her throat were the marks of fingers. Edward Shu was arrested and charged with murder. When the police investigated his background, they found some suspicious facts. Edward had a violent temper. He had beaten his first wife severely and thrown her out of the house. His second wife had died mysteriously of a blow to the head. As he sat in his jail cell, Edward was sure he would not be convicted of Zona's murder. He told everyone who would listen that there was no evidence against him. During the trial, Zona's mother was called to testify on the stand. She told the jury how Zona's ghost had appeared to her and revealed the name of her murderer. Nobody knows if the jury took her story seriously, but they did come back with a guilty verdict and Edward was sentenced to life in prison. He died a few years later in Moundsville Penitentiary. Today, there is a sign on the highway near Greenbrier. It reads, "Greenbrier Ghost. Interred in nearby cemetery is Zona Heaster Shu. Her death in 1897 was presumed natural until her spirit appeared to her mother to describe how she was killed by her husband Edward. Autopsy on the exhumed body verified the apparition's account. Edward, found guilty of murder, was sentenced to the state prison. Only known case in which testimony from ghost helped convict a murderer." Second story. San Cristobal. The sentry boxes, or garritas, in San Cristobal were built in 1634 and used by the Spanish soldiers to guard the city walls at night. Many of the sentry boxes were quite isolated and lonely, and at night the guards would shout out to each other in their boxes to make sure everything was okay. But there was one sentry box in which none of the soldiers wanted to spend the night. It was the most distant and lonely one, standing on a cliff in Fort San Cristobal, the oldest part of the fort's defenses. Guards who stayed there overnight told strange stories of eerie sounds and whispering voices they could hear in the still of the night. They said it sounded like evil spirits or demons were talking to each other. One night, it was the turn of a soldier named Sanchez to be the guard on duty there. Like every other night, the occasional shouts from one guard to another were heard, but nothing was heard from the sentry box that Sanchez was guarding. Whenever one of the other soldiers called to him, there was no reply. The other soldiers became worried during the rest of the night, and trembled thinking about what may have happened to their friend. At sunrise all went to check on Sanchez and found his sentry box empty. They found his rifle and his uniform, but Sanchez himself had vanished without a trace. Sanchez was just the first of many soldiers who would disappear from that sentry box in San Cristobal in the years that followed. Each time, when the soldiers went to check on their fellow guard, they would find nothing but his rifle and his uniform. No traces of the men were ever found, and their families never heard from them again. The mystery was never solved, and the San Cristobal sentry box came to be called the Devil's Sentry Box, or La Garita del Diablo, because the soldiers all believed that their colleagues had been spirited away and devoured by the devil. Third story. Bannister Doll. There was a teenage girl named Dorothy Bannister who lived with her father in an old mansion called Bannister Hall in the town of Preston in Lancashire, England. Her nickname was Dolly, and the local people called her the Bannister Doll. Dolly was a very attractive girl, and she got a lot of attention from young men. Most of the boys in the town were chasing after her. One day, Dolly went to her father and nervously told him she had something to confess. She was pregnant. When her father heard this, he flew into a violent rage. Seething with anger, he dragged the teenage girl out to the garden and chained her to a stone. Then, he whipped her to death for embarrassing her family. Years later, the stone where Dolly had been so brutally murdered was still standing, and mothers would take their young daughters to see it as a warning of what could happen if they got pregnant. None of the girls in town wanted to end up like the Bannister doll. Dolly's body was buried in the grounds of the Holy Trinity Church at Preston, but the story doesn't end there. Not long after the Bannister doll's death, the corpse of a young man was found lying in the center of Preston. His skull had been smashed to smithereens and his ribcage had been beaten to a pulp. The authorities were mystified as to how he'd met his end. 2 weeks later, the dead body of a second young man was discovered in similar circumstances. When a third young man was found dead, rumors began to spread around the town like wildfire. They said that the ghost of Dolly Bannister had returned from the grave to wreak vengeance on all young men for the way her father had so cruelly murdered her. Some people claimed that they had seen the ghost of a young girl in chains floating up Snow Hill at dusk. The sight of her terrified anyone who caught a glimpse of her. It was said that if you heard the chains rattling of a dark night, your days were numbered. After Dolly's father died, a new family moved into the house, but they didn't stay long. The ghost of the Bannister doll appeared to them and harassed them for 2 nights before they left the house, never to return. Another family moved in, but they only managed to stick it out for 3 nights before they fled in terror. The Bannister doll is still occasionally seen in Preston, and those who have seen her report feeling an aura of tremendous fear and chilling malevolence, a stark contrast to the shy and mild young woman she was in life. 4th story. Tie a Noose. Many years ago, there was a young Scottish girl named Anna Dorothea Swartz who traveled to the United States to seek her fortune. She came to work as a servant in a large stone house near the town of Catskill in New York State. The man who owned the house was a mean-tempered and violent individual called William Salisbury. He had paid for her ticket to come to America, and, as soon as she began working for him, she realized what kind of a man he was. He treated her like a slave and told her she wouldn't be paid until she had worked off the cost of her ticket. She was trapped. Salisbury was vicious and brutal, taking pleasure in the suffering of others. He frequently lost his temper at Anna and looked for any reason to beat or abuse her. On one occasion, he caught her passing by a closed door and accused her of eavesdropping on a conversation between him and his wife. Despite the young girl's protests, he took her outside and whipped her until her entire body was covered in welts and bruises. Salisbury was so cruel to Anna that she couldn't stand it anymore, and, one day, she decided to run away. When Salisbury found out she was missing, his anger knew no bounds. Cursing and swearing, he jumped on his horse and chased her across the countryside. The furious man relentlessly pursued poor Anna and scoured the woods until he eventually found her desperately fleeing through the trees. When Salisbury caught her, he took a cord and tied her hands to the tail of his horse. Then, he dragged her all the way back to his house. By the time they reached the home, she was dead. Her frail body had been dashed to pieces on the rocks and stones that covered the country road. All that was left of her was a tattered, bloody mess. Salisbury was arrested and tried for murder. In court, he claimed that he hadn't meant to harm the girl at all and said he was only trying to teach her a lesson. According to the story he told, his horse had become frightened and reared up, throwing him off. Then, the horse bolted and dragged the young girl to her death. He tried to explain it all away as a tragic accident. In the end, the jury didn't believe his story and Salisbury was given the death penalty. He was sentenced to be hanged by the neck for the crime of murder. However, Salisbury was a rich man and money can buy many things. In this case, he used his money to bribe the judge. His sentence was suspended until he was 99 years of age, if he actually lived that long. In the meantime, he was ordered to wear a hangman's noose around his neck to remind him of his crime. He was ordered to report to the judge at Catskill once a year to make sure he was keeping the noose tied around his neck. After the trial, he was a changed man. Wherever he went, people would see the hangman's noose and they stared and pointed at him, knowing he was a murderer. He couldn't escape the shame. Salisbury became an outcast and nobody in the town would associate with him. Soon afterwards, rumors began to circulate that the ghost of the young girl had been seen in the area. Sometimes, she would be spotted sitting on the stone wall at the bottom of his garden, with hellish flames rising from her fingertips and the sound of unearthly laughter coming from her lips. At other times, the ghost of the poor murdered girl was spotted, tied to a ghastly horse that dashed past the man's window every night. Those who saw her described her as a bloody skeleton with tattered garments and streaming hair flapping in the wind. The clatter of hooves on the rocks and the girl's terrified shrieks echoed outside Salisbury's window the whole night long. People would walk miles to avoid passing Salisbury's house, not wanting to hear the horrible screams of the dead. As the years went by, Salisbury became a recluse, never speaking to anyone and spending his time alone in his house. They say the ghost of the murdered girl tormented him every night, eventually driving him insane. One day, his dead body was found hanging from the ceiling of his house. Whether he was driven to suicide by guilt and remorse or if he was forced into it by the ghost, nobody knows. Whatever the reason, he had taken his own life with the very noose that he was ordered to wear around his neck. Fifth story. Yellow Boy. One of the rooms in Knebworth House is said to be haunted by a ghost called the Yellow Boy. According to the legend, if you spend the night in the haunted room, the ghost will appear and predict the way in which you will die. A man named Lord Castlereagh once stayed at Knebworth. His host let him sleep in the haunted room, but forgot to warn him about the legend. In the morning, Lord Castlereagh came down to breakfast, but he looked tired and pale. When Lord Lytton asked him what was wrong, he said that in the middle of the night, he had been awakened with a violent start. When he opened his eyes, he saw the ghostly figure of a young boy with long golden hair sitting in front of the fire. As he watched, the boy slowly stood up and turned around. With a sad expression on his face, he drew his fingers across his throat 3 times and vanished into thin air. When he heard this, a chill ran down Lord Lytton's spine. He didn't have the heart to tell his friend about the legend of the Yellow Boy. Lord Castlereagh went home a few days later and soon forgot about the apparition he had seen. However, a few years later, he suffered a nervous breakdown. He was very depressed and felt like he was losing his mind. One day, he told his wife and his servant that he didn't feel well and told them to fetch a doctor. When they returned, Lord Castlereagh suddenly grabbed a penknife from his desk drawer and committed suicide by cutting his own throat.